The crack of a folder snapping shut rang louder than it should have in the boardroom. We were 40 floors above Chicago, glass walls framing the skyline. But all I could see was Marcus Hale's face smooth, polished, rehearsed. His voice carried no hesitation as he announced, "Effective immediately. Elena Marlowe, you are terminated." No tremor, no pause. Just a scalpel slicing my career in front of 24 directors. Pens froze. Someone's coffee cup stopped mid-air. My own breath caught, sharp and metallic, as if the oxygen had turned to iron. He stepped forward, waving a folder like a stage prop, milking the performance. The directors craned their necks, some sympathetic, most curious, all relieved it wasn't them. Marcus thrived on that spectacle over substance. But then, in his careless arrogance, he lifted the wrong folder. The page inside flashed only for a second, but in that second, I saw my own handwriting, my signature, sprawled across a licensing contract I had drafted years ago. No one else noticed. Their eyes were locked on him. Mine burned into that single sheet of paper as it disappeared back into the stack. My pulse slowed. The humiliation should have crushed me. Instead, clarity crept in. 6 years of building Apex Nova's backbone condensed into one brutal sentence, but also one careless gesture. He thought he was burying me. He didn't realize he had just handed me the seed of my survival. The directors shifted in their seats, waiting for me to break. Some looked pitying, others hungry for drama. Marcus's smirk told them they were about to see me unravel. Instead, I gathered my notes with deliberate calm. I rose, smoothed my blazer, and looked him squarely in the eye. My throat was dry, but my voice was steady. "Thank you," I said. A murmur rustled through the room. They mistook it for surrender, for weakness. Marcus tilted his head. Satisfied, already moving on to the next agenda item. But I walked out of that boardroom with more than dismissal papers. I carried a secret no one else had seen, one that would soon make his victory collapse under its own weight. And as the elevator doors closed behind me, I knew the real story hadn't even begun. The hum of the elevator faded, but the silence that followed pressed harder than the stairs I'd left behind. I gripped the folder in my hands, though there was nothing inside it worth holding. What lingered instead were the years I had poured into this company. Years Marcus dismissed in a single sentence. 6 years ago. Apex Nova was a brittle dream. The budgets collapsed so often I lost count. Servers shut down mid-project, and half the office went dark during winter blackouts. I coded with a flashlight balanced against a mug, coaxing life from machines that should have been retired a decade earlier. My reward wasn't recognition, it was survival. I missed my father's funeral because a funding round teetered on collapse. I sat in a windowless lab while strangers buried the man who raised me. I told myself it was temporary, that one day the sacrifice would mean stability, legacy. But the truth was, my absence was just one more invisible cost paid to keep Apex Nova afloat. And Marcus, he had always been waiting. Years earlier, when my team finally delivered a modular prototype, he snatched the launch. The press release carried his name in bold, while my work was buried in fine print. I remember standing in the back of that crowded hall, hearing him recite words I'd written, ideas I'd nurtured, as though they had sprung from his polished mouth. The applause that day still rings louder in my memory than anything I've built since. My sweat had been their currency, my silence, their opportunity. I told myself I didn't need the spotlight, that progress was enough, that the platform itself was proof. But sitting there in the lobby now, watching employees pass me as though I were already erased, I wondered how many more pieces of myself I had traded away without realizing it. The phone in my bag buzzed once, then again messages piling in. I hadn't even looked yet, but I knew they weren't congratulations. They were the ripples of Marcus's decision, reaching the very people I'd spent years protecting. Morning came heavy. the kind of gray that seeped through blinds and made even the air feel tired. I hadn't slept much, replaying Marcus's smirk and the flash of that contract page in an endless loop. My phone lay face down on the kitchen table, buzzing every few minutes like a trapped insect. Eventually, I gave in. Logan's name filled the screen first. Are we even allowed to keep coding? The message carried more fear than question, as if he were asking permission to breathe. Right after, Priya HR froze our access. We can't even open the repository. Then Dylan, ever blunt. Guess we're disposable after all. Their words sank into me, each one a reminder that Marcus hadn't just severed me, he'd left the whole team drifting. I had promised them stability, a place where creativity could outshine bureaucracy, and now they were stranded in the storm I had built to protect them from. I typed, erased, retyped. What comfort could I offer when I had nothing to give? I set the phone down, heart aching, when another buzz lit the screen. Jason, the intern who barely spoke above a whisper, who everyone underestimated, myself included. His text was short, almost casual. They don't know who really holds the original patent, do they? My breath caught. My thumb hovered above the glass as though it might burn me. Of all people, it was Jason who had glimpsed the truth, the clause, the shell company, the safeguards no one else knew existed. I leaned back, the chair creaking under my weight, pulse hammering in my ears. For the first time since that boardroom, the silence inside me shifted, no longer hollow, but charged. The secret I had buried wasn't just mine anymore. Someone else had seen the outline of it, and if an intern could, then maybe it was only a matter of time before others did too. The messages on my phone blurred together, a storm of confusion and doubt, but Jason's words cut clean through a reminder that the game hadn't ended. It had only just begun. That night, my apartment looked less like a home and more like an archive of battles no one else remembered. Stacks of binders leaned precariously against the walls, their spines cracked from years of being dragged into meetings where budgets were slashed and projects gutted. I pulled them out one by one, spreading them across the table until there was no room left for anything but paper and dust. The radiator clanked in the corner, throwing out more noise than heat. Paint peeled in narrow strips from the wall above it. I thought of Marcus in his penthouse, marble floors gleaming, skyline views curated for investor calls. He had the gloss, I had the grind. My fingers ached as I flipped through folder after folder. Most pages blurred into one another, old contracts, meeting minutes, failed grant proposals. Then, tucked between quarterly reports, I found it, a yellowed envelope with my handwriting scrawled across the front contingency. Inside, the clause I'd written 2 years ago stared back at me in neat, measured lines. In the event of termination of project funding or leadership oversight, all rights revert to the original architect until reintegration is complete. I exhaled slowly, the paper trembling in my hands. It had been nothing more than a precaution back then, drafted in the dead of night after finance announced another realignment. I never thought it would be invoked, but Marcus, in his arrogance, had just triggered it. By cutting me off, he'd handed me back everything. The room didn't change the cracked walls, the flickering lamp, the hum of traffic outside remained, but suddenly it felt different, less like a prison, more like a command center. I wasn't erased. I wasn't powerless. I was holding the key that Marcus didn't even know existed. For 6 years I had carried Apex Nova on my back, and now, with one careless gesture, Marcus had set me free to decide its fate. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Logan, this time sharper, more desperate. The storm inside the company was only just beginning to break the surface. 9 days later, the spotlight belonged to Marcus. Manhattan's glass auditorium gleamed with moneyed expectation. Rows of investors in dark suits leaning forward as though the future itself would be unveiled on stage. I wasn't there, not in body. But I didn't need to be. My phone glowed with a steady stream of updates from the few engineers who still believed in me enough to keep me close. Marcus strode across the stage like a showman, hands slicing through the air, voice coated with certainty. "Today," he declared, "you will witness the flawless performance of Apex Nova's modular platform. Efficiency, scalability, stability. We deliver all three." The applause was rehearsed, the smiles polite, but the system waiting behind the curtain wasn't his to command. The first screen lit up in sterile gray. Then, in block letters, "License authorization expired." At first, the room buzzed with low confusion, the polite sort that papers over glitches in live demos. Marcus laughed, the kind of hollow chuckle meant to shrink disaster into a hiccup. 2 minutes, he said, waving toward the engineers huddled at the back. 2 minutes became 10. 10 stretched toward 20. Every attempt produced the same cold line across the screen. "License authorization expired," from my apartment. I leaned back in the chair, scrolling through the Slack channel. Logan. "They're stalling. Ops can't access staging. Priya a single lock emoji. Dylan guess ghosts can still haunt systems." The image formed in my mind. Marcus sweating under stage lights. Collar tight, while investors shifted, whispered, checked their watches. My heart didn't race. It steadied. This was no accident. This was the system protecting itself, my claws flexing its quiet authority in real time. On stage, Ellen from operations finally broke the silence, raising her tablet for all to see. "Are we saying we've actually lost control of the platform?" The words cracked the facade like glass splintering. Marcus's smile faltered, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the panic underneath. And I sat miles away, watching through updates and whispers, knowing this was only the first fracture in his empire. By evening, Marcus had spun the narrative. Press releases flooded the wires, system fully restored. Stability confirmed. Investor confidence remains strong. His photo, crisp and triumphant, appeared on half a dozen tech sites as the man who had steered Apex Nova through minor turbulence. For a moment, it worked. Markets calmed. The board exhaled. Even some of my old team messaged in uncertainty, Logan asking if maybe Marcus had patched the issue, Priya sending nothing but a question mark. I let the phone buzz unanswered. Let them sit in doubt for one more night, because I knew what Marcus didn't. You can't fake authorization. You can't bluff the architecture. A shell demo might fool cameras and headlines, but the system always demands the truth. The next morning, truth arrived with merciless precision. At 9:17 a.m., servers buckled. Client sandboxes went dark. Demo environments failed to load. Investor testbeds, those carefully curated showcases, blinked out one by one. Across the country, screens filled with the same gray verdict. License authorization expired. My Slack feed lit up like a storm. "Dylan, he's losing it. They can't access anything. Logan boardroom's on fire. Priya reporters are circling." The headlines followed within the hour. Catastrophic system collapse at Apex Nova. Was yesterday's demo a lie, sabotage, or incompetence inside the company? Chaos erupted. Marcus shouted about sabotage, demanded logs, waved his hands as though volume could substitute for proof. But the board wasn't buying it. "You misled us," one director snapped, the words sharp enough to cut the last thread of Marcus's confidence. His face drained of color, arrogance leaking away like air from a punctured balloon. I sat in my apartment, coffee cooling at my side, reading every frantic update. No panic tightened my chest this time, no guilt. The collapse was his now, not mine. And as the news anchors dissected every frame of his failed demo, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen since the day of my firing. The number flashing across my phone was one I recognized instantly: Human Resources. For a moment I considered letting it ring, but curiosity won. "Elena," the voice chirped, practiced warmth dripping through the line. "How are you holding up? We've been so concerned. Concern." The word nearly made me laugh. Where was their concern when Marcus cut me down in front of the board, when my team spiraled into panic? Still, I stayed quiet. We'd love to restore continuity. She pressed on. Leadership has been talking. We feel it would be mutually beneficial if you came back. A generous compensation package, of course. Adjusted title. Prestige. You'd have the recognition you deserve. Her words were dressed in silk, but underneath was desperation. Marcus was drowning, and they thought dangling money and titles might build him a lifeboat. I let the silence stretch until she faltered. Then her tone hardened. Of course, she added quickly, we do need to address the matter of intellectual property. The board is concerned. If you're holding any company assets, that could be problematic. There it was the threat. A shift from honey to glass shards. I laughed softly, letting the sound cut through her script. Clause 7.2, I said evenly. Read it again. You'll find the rights revert to me. You can't threaten me with what you never owned. Her breathing hitched. Papers rustled as if she were flipping desperately through a binder for a lifeline. I gave her none. You don't have enough money to buy back the truth. I continued. Not the nights I gave up. Not the years I spent holding together a system your executives barely understood, and certainly not my silence. The line went dead quiet, her voice swallowed by the weight of words she couldn't undo. I ended the call myself, steady and calm, and for the first time since Marcus's ambush, I felt no trace of doubt, only clarity. 2 days later, another message arrived in my inbox, this time from a name I hadn't seen in years. The cafe smelled of burnt espresso and old wood, tucked away on a quiet corner in Austin where no one cared about corporate empires crumbling hundreds of miles north. I slid into a booth across from Chris Dalton, a face I hadn't seen since Marcus shoved him out during a restructuring. Time had carved lines at the edges of his eyes, but his grin was still half challenge, half amusement. Elena Marlowe, he said, leaning back. Didn't think I'd see the day you'd be on the outside looking in. Life surprises, I replied evenly. He chuckled, shaking his head. Marcus always did have a talent for driving out the ones who actually matter. First me, now you. Difference is, you built more than he ever understood. I studied him carefully, searching for the angle. He didn't bother hiding it. A tablet appeared from his bag, screen glowing with a contract I knew by heart. He tapped a highlighted clause. Marcus doesn't know, does he, that you alone can activate the modules. Without you, Apex Nova's empire is just a shell. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew he was right. Chris slid another document across the table, this one bearing Ardent Dynamics letterhead. 1.5 billion, he said simply. For the patent? No strings, just signatures. The number looked unreal on the page, large enough to rewrite any ledger, yet my hesitation wasn't about money. I thought of sleepless nights, of the system I had nurtured like a child, of the fear I had felt watching Marcus twisted into theater. I wouldn't trade one master for another, so I pulled a second page from my own folder and slid it across. One condition, I said. I stay on as guardian architect, not an employee, not a figurehead its protector. The system doesn't move without my oversight. Chris's grin widened slowly. Protecting your work even after you walk away. I should have expected nothing less. When the pen touched the contract, I felt something sharp and liberating, not revenge, but redefinition. And as I left the cafe, news alerts of Apex Nova's plummeting stock lit up my phone. By the end of the week, headlines bled red. Apex Nova's stock nosedived in free fall, billions shaved from its valuation in a single morning. Investors fled, contracts dissolved, and partners who once praised Marcus now refused to take his calls. Every financial ticker carried the same story, a giant gutted by arrogance. I sat in my apartment, phone buzzing nonstop with news alerts. Clips of Marcus played on every channel. his polished mask stripped away. He stammered through investor calls, voice brittle, insisting the hiccups were temporary. But the numbers told the truth he couldn't bury. The board moved quickly, cornered by their own negligence. In one meeting leaked to the press, a director's voice rang out, "You misled us." Soon after, the accusations grew sharper: fraudulent disclosures, reckless reporting, manipulating investors with false claims of stability. It wasn't just incompetence anymore, it was potentially criminal. When federal regulators announced an inquiry, the tide turned fully. Subpoenas were issued, investigators stepped into the glossy lobby of Apex Nova, and Marcus was summoned for questioning. The man who once strutted through corridors as though he owned time itself now looked hunted. I watched the press conference live. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved in his face. Marcus stood slouched at the podium, tie loosened, eyes hollow. Gone was the arrogance that had filled that boardroom the day he cut me down. What remained was a shell of a man unraveling under the weight of his own lies. The board had no choice. His resignation was forced within hours, announced not with fanfare, but with a sterile statement buried between stock updates, a legacy extinguished in a paragraph. On screen, Marcus's shoulders sagged as if the air itself had betrayed him. The same reporters who once hailed him now tore him apart with questions he couldn't answer. I closed the laptop, a strange calm settling over me. He had taken everything he thought mattered, and now the empire he built on deception had collapsed into rubble at his feet. 2 days later, I stood beneath brighter lights, pen poised over a contract that bore my name. The lights in the Austin press hall were blinding, hotter than any boardroom glare I had endured. Cameras lined the back wall in a jagged row, lenses focused on the table before me. At its center, the contract lay open, my name, printed neatly at the top. A valuation so large it looked almost unreal. 1.5 billion? Reporters jostled, murmurs rippling as flashbulbs flared. Chris Dalton stood nearby, calm but watchful. His grin subdued this time. This moment wasn't about him, or even Ardent Dynamics. It was about me, and the work they had all once dismissed as replaceable. I lifted the pen, steady hands betraying none of the storms that had carried me here. 6 years of sacrifice, of coding through blackouts and bargaining for scraps of funding, condensed into the weight of ink about to touch paper. Across the country, Apex Nova was unraveling. Marcus reduced to a headline about arrogance and oversight, yet here, in this room, I wasn't a casualty. I was the author of my own ending. When the pen scratched across the page, flashbulbs erupted in a frenzy. Voices shouted my name, demanding a statement. I closed the folder, rose slowly, and let the silence settle just long enough to command the room. "Thank you," I whispered, the same words I had spoken the day Marcus fired me. This time, it wasn't surrender. It was triumph. Gratitude not for what they had taken, but for what they had unknowingly returned to me, the freedom to define my worth without their permission. I stepped back from the podium, shoulders unbowed, pride burning bright in my chest. Power, I realized, had never lived in titles or corner offices. It lived in preparation, in ownership, in the quiet dignity of refusing to be erased. And as the crowd erupted in questions, cameras flashing like stars, I carried the words with me not as an ending, but as the anthem of everything I had become.